So, in today's video, we're going to be talking about IFS, that is internal family systems, which is a modality of therapy that's often used in psychedelic therapy. And I get asked a lot about what my thoughts are about this, if I like it, if I think it's effective. So, in this video today, I'm going to share with you my personal, honest opinion about what I think about IFS in general, and also in the context of psychedelic therapy, what I think the strengths are, what I think the weaknesses are, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you're interested in IFS or psychedelic therapy, or if you're someone who's either a fan or practitioner, and you just want to know another psychedelic therapist point of view, please join me. Okay, so before we go ahead and get into the specifics of the conversation, let's just set some context first here to be fair, because I realize some of you know what IFS is, some of you don't. Some of you might be curious therapists who somehow landed on this video because you're interested in IFS, not because you're interested in psychedelic therapy or my work or channel in particular. So, first of all, if you're new to the channel, my name is Dave. Hello, nice to meet you. I am a trained coach, trained hypnotherapist, NLP practitioner, overall nerd for therapy, although I'm not a licensed therapist. Okay, so I'm a trained hypnotherapist, but I'm not a licensed therapist. I want to be clear about that. With that being said, I have a long personal history with psychedelics. I do psychedelic support work with people. I'm in the psychedelic therapy community. I'm in the conversation. I'm always voraciously learning and sharing here on the channel my thoughts about how to integrate spirituality, personal development, psychedelic therapy, therapy techniques, healing, growth, awakening, etc. So that's generally speaking what you're going to find here on the channel, and a little bit about my background. Okay, about IFS. So if you're not familiar, IFS is a acronym, a short abbreviation for internal family systems. So internal family systems is a model of therapy. It's been around for, I want to say, at least a good 20, 30 years, right? It's been around for a while, but in the last 5 to 10 years, it's gained a lot of traction, especially in the trauma therapy community. It's one of the favored kind of buzz, like new hot modalities right now. And a lot of therapists are just training in it, learning about it. And especially in the psychedelic therapy community, it's particularly something that's favored as one of the more compatible tools with psychedelic states. So that's what I'm talking about here, because it is the hot thing, right? It is the hot modality. And like any modality, when it starts to arise, there's a whole conversation to be had around, the concepts of that modality versus the reality of the territory of working with people. But I digress. We'll get into that in a minute. For broader context here, just so you know, I'm not trained in IFS, okay? I'm well read in it, I'm studied in it, I've trained in other forms of parts work that parallel IFS. I have peers who are excellent, top-notch IFS practitioners who I massively respect. I'm literate enough with IFS. I'm familiar enough with it. I've read the books, I've watched the podcasts, I've but I've not paid the money and done the full, thorough training. So there may be gaps in my conception, gaps in my knowledge, gaps in my understanding. I want to be fully transparent about that and be intellectually honest about that, so that if you are an IFS practitioner, or even better, a psychedelic assisted IFS practitioner, and I say something here that is really out of ignorance, feel free to leave a comment down below and either correct me or invite me to a conversation or what have you. I welcome that, okay? So I want to be clear that that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I'm coming a little bit from the outside of the IFS community, in the sense that I feel like I'm fairly literate in the concepts and the ideas, but not thoroughly steeped in them, okay? So with that being said, let me share a little bit and create a little context for you on my perspective on IFS and its role both in regular kind of therapeutic work and in psychedelic therapy work, and where I think its strengths are and where I think its weaknesses are, and just give my opinion. Okay, so to properly contextualize my perspective on this, first I want to just share with you this graphic that, if some of you have seen the channel before, you may have seen me share this. If you're new to the channel or just don't watch all my videos, you may have missed this graphic. But basically, this is a graphic I created a while ago to try to describe the different kind of schools of work that I see in different models of therapy and change work and coaching, and also different ways that I see the nervous system go in general, like even in just a normal client session, but particularly in psychedelic therapy sessions. These are kind of the 4 different directions that I see people's consciousness or somatic or, deeper intelligence move towards, right? So I want to contextualize this because this definitely applies to IFS. So, the way I look at these four directions, there are different tools that are kind of optimal or best for the four different directions, right? So, going clockwise, starting with the left here, from the 9 o'clock position, we have going towards the problem. Now, the tool that I use for going towards the problem, in other words, when a person's nervous system is kind of hung up on really trying to or needing to process the issue first, that's where I go to co regulation, self regulation. That's where I go to attachment work. And this is really why I created the course that I just released, the Secure Self Relating course, which, if you're interested in, link will be down below in the description. But basically, we need a set of skills for when the person's nervous system just goes right to the trigger, or right to the issue, or right to the fear, right? From there, if we're going clockwise, another way that the nervous system will often go, especially on high dose psychedelics, is towards the transpersonal, towards the spiritual, towards the non dual, right? Especially if we're talking a solid dose of, psilocybin, LSD, DMT. This is a whole other way of working with the nervous system, right? So you need a different set of understandings, a different set of skills, et cetera, right? Going clockwise from there, we have towards the resource. So this is the emergence of positive emotional states, insights, joy, love, compassion, feeling safe, feeling whole, feeling vibrantly alive, feeling compassion, etc. Right? So the emergence of some powerful, positive resource state, right? So sometimes, whether I'm working with a client and we start to do change work, or I'm starting to work with someone and we're doing, say, a psychedelic assisted session, their nervous system will just want to go straight towards love or towards compassion or towards peace. And then the question is, how do we utilize this resource state in a way that's transformative, in a way that's healing? So again, I would say there's a different set of tools for when the person's system wants to go towards the resource. Lastly, of course, we have parts, which I think of as kind of, if the transpersonal is kind of moving beyond the self into the larger sense of experience as part of the wholeness of the universe, parts would be about going down into the sub aspects of the self, right? So this is really where IFS shines, in my personal opinion. So my first thought here is IFS as a tool for parts, for managing and helping to heal and resolve parts, is highly effective. Or kind of over in this territory here of parts and being towards the problem states, also highly effective. IFS also has a relationship to the transpersonal that, if you're an IFS practitioner, you might be at this point kind of, screaming at the screen going, but there's transpersonal. I know. So if you don't know, IFS also does deal with the transpersonal self, but it's that relationship between the parts and the transpersonal that's really the essence of IFS, in my view, in my perspective. So that's kind of, I want to contextualize it here. So I think of IFS as being really the go-to skill for dealing with parts whenever a person's nervous system gets into, regressing to certain memories or certain triggers, or a certain unintegrated aspect of their personality pops up in a session that's a problem in their life and they don't know what to do with it. This kind of a thing, I think parts, IFS is ideal for parts work, or one of the ideal tools for parts work. With that being said, it's not necessarily my go-to for going towards the problem or towards the resource or towards the transpersonal necessarily. So let me give a little more context here, and we'll just kind of unpack a little bit my thoughts on where IFS kind of goes wrong, or where I don't like it so much, and also, again, where I think it's great. So some other great things I can say about IFS from personal experience here. A few things. So first of all, when parts work is effective, it's shocking, it's striking how palpable you can feel a sense that something has moved and changed internally. And I think that that's beautiful and necessary. I think it's really important for people to not only have change happen at the unconscious level, but register that change, to consciously process, wow, something really feels different in my body. Something feels really different around this topic, or really different around this emotion now. I think that integration is really a key part of the experience. And in my experience, IFS can be really powerful at delivering change. and delivering like an integration of that change. And I love that about IFS. I will also say, in my experience, for the most part, the IFS practitioners that I've met are tuned into dynamics about internal relationship and just relationship in general. They catch nuances in language, in body language, in the expressed experience of the client that are such little details that I think a lot of therapists would just gloss over or not really catch or not really know what to do with. And so there's a refinement of attention there that I think is beautiful and admirable. And I think that the overall way that the skill manifests for people is it's skillful, for lack of a better term. Something that is really hit home for me over the last few years in my own trainings is what it really means and what it looks like and what it feels like to be in the presence of a highly skillful therapist or a highly skillful, energy worker or coach worker or coach worker, coach, or whatever it is. When you're in the presence of someone highly skillful, there is a way that they are. There is a way that they are embodied. There's a way that they use their attention. There's a way that they interact. And that there's variety within that, but there is a way. And what I notice a lot with IFS practitioners, especially the really skilled ones, is that they have that quality. And so I really admire that. But with that said, I want to share what my critiques are here because I actually do have some critiques of IFS, and it's more to do with the model than with the practitioners or anything like that. So overall, I think, just to be clear, as a trauma-informed therapy modality, I think it's highly effective. I think for psychedelic therapy, it can work really well at moderate doses. At higher doses, it starts to break down. But then again, that's kind of true with all therapy. Like at a certain level of high dose experience, all you can is hold space for the person and let them experience what they're going to experience and make sure that they're physically safe, right? So that's true. That's not the fault of IFS. That's just the reality of psychedelics. But in terms of models that are compatible with psychedelics, IFS, when done properly, can be incredible. So more positive words there. I have a lot of love for IFS, but I do have some critiques. So I'd like to share those with you now. Okay, so you've heard me yammer on long enough, and you're probably wondering, okay, Dave, what are your critiques of IFS? Just spill the beans, get it out. Let's go. So let me just cut to the chase here and share with you a couple of my major concerns with IFS. So there are three that come to mind immediately here that I'll communicate. And if you have more questions or want to hear more, I don't want to make more videos dumping on it, but I'm happy to clarify. Okay. So my first and major critique of IFS is in the model, right? And I think it's really important in general, especially if you're a layperson who's not a therapist, but even as a therapist, this is really highly important to understand that we need to make the distinction between model and truth, or model and the direct experiential reality of the client or of the client therapist interaction, right? So it's really, really important to not confuse models with reality, because models do break down. Models do have limitations. Models have flaws. Some models, can be very narrow in scope or not very flexible or kind of rigid and only work in certain contexts, but not others. I could get into a whole set of videos, frankly, but at least a video about this discrepancy between model and reality. But I think it's an important thing to really wrap our heads around. So in NLP and hypnosis and the personal development world, you've probably heard the phrase, the map is not the territory. And that's what they're saying here, is that the map, meaning the model, is not the territory, meaning the actual experience of the session or the actual experience of the client. Another way of saying this, if that's confusing, is the menu is not the food, right? We don't eat the food. The menu is not the experience of the food in your mouth and the way it tastes and the way it feels and the way your body responds to it. The menu is just the picture, right? It's just a description of the food. So the model is just a description of one way of organizing an understanding of internal experience. Okay, so with IFS in the model, where I think, here's my critique, essentially, is that it is overly complicated sometimes. It can overly confuse people, right? It's highly technical. And I think really getting into the ascribing of roles of parts, getting into the age of the part and the personification of the part and the set of memories of the part, and really getting into like parts as personalities. All of that, I think, obscures what the important aspect of this is. So, what I see a lot is that IFS practitioners really get into this concept of multiplicity, then they confuse that for the truth of the human nervous system or the human ego or the human mind or the human personality. And they get really into, okay, well, what is this part and what's its age and what type of part is it, and blah 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 blah, right? I think all of that really obscures where the healing actually happens, which is in the way that we relate to the parts, the relational quality, tone, space we hold with the parts, and the way that parts relate to each other. Okay, so for me, where the power is in healing, the transformative power isn't in the narrative of the part or the personification of the part. The power is in the relational connection between parts, or between observer and parts, or between therapist and parts, etc. It's the relational approach, the relational space, the way that parts are held and seen and understood and connected to, that for my money is where the healing is. Okay, so this is obviously, again, why I made the course, why I'm emphasizing attachment work, and why I'm emphasizing relational, co-regulation as being the healing thing. This is why I made the secure self-relating course, which, by the way, link down below. The reason is that the healing power isn't in the narrative. It's not in the story. It's in the relating. The healing power is in the sense of connectedness, the sense of being felt, the sense of being seen, attuned to, understood, worked with, right? Supported, right? That's where the healing is, right? So the major thing that my major gripe here is I think it's overly complicated when we start to get into the personification of parts and the roles and the history and the age and the memories and blah, 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 right? It can really cause a person to get confused, lost in the sauce. And from my experience, my guess is that the reason for that is that this starts to give context for why these parts are here, right? And often what the underlying wound or issue that memory or that part or that adaptive experience holds, right? And I think the assumption is that we need to personify this stuff, and I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong here, that we need to kind of give name and voice and memory to these things so that whatever needs to be understood there can be kind of elicited from the part. I would say, though, that if you're just simply listening and relating and tracking and creating connection, what is relevant, what wound, what memory, what thing is relevant will naturally, organically emerge. And we don't have to go through the process of necessarily like trying to define that so clearly. So when I'm doing parts work with people, for context here, my focus is on the way of relating and helping that person understand a way of relating that's healing, and not so much about what is this part's age or role or et cetera, but just kind of being agnostic about that, not holding that all loosely, but just being with the relating part of things. So that's my biggest critique. Some other critiques that kind of parallel that here. So what I often see is that when lay people learn IFS, right? They read an IFS book or three and they start to do IFS on themselves, especially in the context of psychedelic therapy, they often will get more fragmented, right? Because they get so into this idea of multiplicity and holding that as truth, and seeing only that angle of their own psyche and nervous system. And they get so into the personification and the memories and the subparts of parts and suddenly they're off in the complexity. And and what I see a lot is people get more confused, they get more lost, they get overwhelmed, they get it's just too much to track, right? And so that's not necessarily IFS's fault, but it is kind of an inevitable thing that as people start to internalize this idea and work with it, that they can overcomplicate it for themselves, and then they end up getting more fragmented. Well, who am I? Am I this part from when I was 3? Am I this part from when I was 7? Am I this part from when I was 12 or 24? Which part is the strongest part? How do I know when I'm hijacked? When it gets really complicated, right? And so this is one of my other big issues with IFS is that I think it's overly technical and overly complicated. And I think even what I see and what I've heard from other practitioners who, I converse with, is that it's not uncommon for practitioners themselves for it to take a long time to get effective healing and transformation because there's so many parts to sort through and things to untangle and relationships and things to learn about. And it can be very slow going work with too much emphasis on complexity. And for people who are maybe not used to being inward with their awareness, not used to interoception, not used to feeling inside, they're not maybe used to tracking that much internal complexity. And while there's a higher fidelity of understanding that may go with that, it can also be really taxing for a client's mind and nervous system to pay that kind of attention for that long of a period, right? It can be really mentally and emotionally exhausting. And a lot of people obviously also really struggle with being kind of blended with or hijacked by a certain part. And then really struggling, to shift in other parts or access other parts or to cleanly unblend. It's really difficult. I think it can really overcomplicate things, right? So while I think there is a useful truism, so I think the role of this complexity and this role of seeing multiplicity, from my point of view, is to give you a little useful distance from some aspect of you that gets triggered or overwhelmed or carries the trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So one major therapeutic tool in general, broadly speaking, is to create a useful distance enough to be able to work with things and not be identified as the thing, because you can't transform something that you are fully identified as and embodied as. How can you work with something that you just are? You can't. So you need space, right? So I think one of the strengths of IFS is also creates some of its weakness, which the strength is to get that useful distance by recognizing parts as parts, not the whole of who you are, which is wonderful. But the downside to that is that as you start seeing parts, you can see only parts and too many parts and all kinds of parts, and suddenly you're lost in the sauce. And that's really where I think IFS underserves people, makes it harder for therapists, makes it harder for clients, makes it harder for lay people who are trying to self-heal. And in the psychedelic context, obviously this can, because the psychedelic mind can render more details and project new layers of things and unpack, sub things within sub things. And there's like an infinity to our awareness in the psychedelic mind space that when you start adding complexity of parts plus that infinity, it can get very complicated very quickly, right? So for me, this is the real, the thing I don't love about IFS. I'm not even going to say it's bad or wrong. It's just, to me, kind of its Achilles heel here, right? It's the thing that I think is the weak spot of this particular modality, the thing that my complaint about it, really. But with that being said, again, of all the tools out there in the psychedelic therapy space, I like IFS a lot better than a lot of other approaches. Again, I think IFS trained therapists are often refined in their attention in a way that a lot of other therapists aren't, quite frankly. And I think there's a lot that's good about it. So that's overall my opinion of IFS. I really have a lot of respect for it. I think it's a beautiful modality. I'm still reading IFS books. I'm still learning more about parts work, and it's certainly a piece of the puzzle to me. I think we just need to kind of keep our eyes on the prize here, right? So some of my teachers, right? So when I've done underground trainings with psychedelic therapists who are very seasoned, very skilled, and very trained in therapy, right? They're not just psychedelic guides, right? These are people who are seasoned therapists as well. And some of them will say that they don't like IFS, that it really steers people's awareness away from that there is a you, that there is a person, that there is a self, that there is a contiguous wholeness, or that there is a transpersonal self sometimes, right? IFS can get so lost in the parts that it can take a long time for people to remember that there is the transpersonal wholeness, the broader, deeper self. So I get that too. Overall, I think it has its place. I think it's really useful. I just think if you're going to use IFS, either as a therapist or as a layperson trying to heal yourself, that you recognize the limitations and the flaws of the model, that you don't hold this thing about parts too religiously or zealously, that you're not too intense about parts, and that you recognize that often the healing of parts is in the relating to the parts or the relationship between parts, not necessarily in the getting the narrative of the part, right? So that's my personal view. This is again why, when I'm doing parts work, my focus is on relating. This is again, my whole thing right now is that so much of where the healing is in the relational frame, right? So take that grain of salt. I am biased. I do have a particular opinion on this. So anyways, that's my thoughts on IFS. I'm going to stop rambling. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Have I been dismissive or rude or offensive in this video? Is there something I said here that resonated for you or that didn't resonate for you? If you do have any comments, I'd love to see them. Leave them down below. If you're interested in the Secure Self-Relating course, there's the free course and the paid course. Both links will be down in the description below, as I mentioned already. And I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Take care.